So hello guys, thank you so much for coming to the first event for Politics and Debating Society with guest speakers. It's great to see you guys here. We're hoping to have a lot more events, maybe one in maybe 3 weeks, 4 weeks time, and we've got plenty of ideas for topics to discuss, but if you guys have ideas that you want to have discussed, then please speak to us at the end and we'll try and accommodate that. And if you want to become more involved with the society as well, please feel free to come and speak to us at the end as well. So thank you for coming, and thank you to our guests for coming. It's great that you made the effort to come, and hopefully this is going to be a really fun debate. Obviously the topic that we're discussing is sensitive, so we just hope that we're going to have a really fun and rigorous debate, but just remember to be respectful at all times because of the nature of the debate. So yeah, guys, if you can just give like a quick 1-2 sentence introduction, that would be fantastic, and then we'll get going. Okay.
Shall I start?
Yep.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming. My name is AJ, and I'm here representing the humanist, atheist point of view in the debate, and I am a sort of community activist and organiser with some humanist groups in London: Young Humanists, Central London Humanists, West London Humanists and Secularists, and South West London Humanists. And I'm looking forward to contributing to the debate today. Thank you.
Cool. And yourself?
I'm Rabbi Daniel Lichman. I am a rabbi in the Jewish denomination of Reform Judaism. I work for Reform Judaism, travelling around the country meeting progressive Jewish students. And progressive Jewish or Reform Jewish means one of the liberal denominations of Judaism. And I also have a community in West Hampstead that I work with.
Hi everybody, thank you for inviting me today. My name is Suk, and I'm with an organisation called the Sikh Press Association. So we basically facilitate contact between Sikh organisations, Sikh individuals and the mainstream media.
My name is Abdul Andalusi. I'm with the Muslim Debate Initiative. As our name suggests, we're an initiative to initiate debate on different topics, political topics, religious topics. We've been doing it for 10 years, and we've been trying to encourage engagement without fear of censor, especially in this kind of climate where there's a lot of things that people worry that they can't say, and we're trying to give people platforms, even controversial people platforms, to have open and frank debate. That's the only way you're ever going to understand each other and maybe come to consensus.
That's great, thank you.
Just say your name again.
AJ.
So if you want to begin, that would be fantastic.
So we're going to start the debate now.
Okay. Thanks very much, everyone, again for coming here today, and to Matt and Gerline and James for inviting me. So I'd like to start off my 5 minutes today with just an overview of how I'm going to spend my time. The first part of it, I want to look at the actual question and look at some of the definitional terms in the question and sort of try and set the framework of how the debate's going to go and offer some possible definitions that could guide our discussion today. And the second part of my 5 minutes, I'm going to present my points and how I think that the question may or may not be answered from the humanist or atheist perspective. So if we just start off with the question, has religion mainly been the cause of violence or peace? So looking at the first part of it, has it been the cause of violence or peace? I don't really think that there's a definite answer to this. I'm going to be open about that right now. I think there is actually the nuance in it. It lies somewhere in the grey area. And the point is not to get a definite answer. I think that's a fool's errand. But I think, and what I hope we can achieve today, is actually increase our understanding of what is meant by religion, what is meant by violence, what is meant by causality, what is meant by peace. I think that's really, given my experience in debates generally, and also in this topic, philosophy, religion, atheism, politics, and so on, that's really what I think we should aim to get out of it. You may disagree, and I look forward to your views in the discussion. So, looking at religion itself in the question, how do we define religion? There are secular fundamentalisms, economic austerity, for example. There's other ways that you can actually define religion other than just the belief in the divine or the supernatural or life after death or divine intervention. So that could be something to explore. Looking at what religion also means in terms of what the founders say it means versus what the actual followers may interpret it to mean, later on. That's also something that I think we should consider. Causality. How do human beings reach decisions? Sometimes we aren't really robots. We don't really have an input and an output. We have many different ways that we come to a decision. It's not always emotional. It's not always rational. It's a mix of the two. And peace and violence. What do we mean by that? Do we mean just literally fighting, wars, ideological violence, violence through language, violence through thought, economic violence, or debt slavery? So I think these kind of things are what I want to get into really in the meat of this debate. So that's I'm sort of giving you a flavour of what I think the basis we could touch on here in this discussion, as well as also maybe trying to answer the question. But I think the journey is really important rather than the destination. And I'd just like to read a quick excerpt here, touching on this aspect of what religion is, from a book by Darrell Reeney called The Death of Forever. He says, religions like Christianity and Islam are, in my view, profaners of the sacred, denying in practice the very truths they profess in principle. The American historian Lewis Mumford summed up the failure of organized Christianity when he said, Karl Marx once said of himself that he was not a Marxist. And Jesus, one may say without reverence, that he was not a Christian. For little men who guarded Jesus' memory took him, drained off the precious lifeblood of his spirit, mummified his body, and wrapped what was left in many foreign wrappings. Over those remains, they proceeded to erect a gigantic tomb, and that tomb was called the Christian Church. So again, we see this aspect of religions change over time, and there's not just one monolithic thing. And in the same way, from an atheistic, humanistic point of view, which seeks to advance human morality, human authority, we don't need divine intervention or some kind of supernatural beliefs. The scientific worldview, the rational worldview, and human intelligence and cognition can, we believe as humanists, offer us all of the tools that we need to solve the problems in society. And something that I think is quite important about religious dogma and fundamentalisms is that it subsumes the individual's creative impulse, creative thinking, critical thinking to the actual spirit of the tribe, of the ocean, or of the whole. So actually you become a mindless drone in some senses. Again, it's not just religions. There's so many other fundamentalisms that do this. Football, fan tribes do this as well. So it's not just something particular about religions, but anything that denies someone's individual cognitive individuality and autonomy, I think is quite bad. And overall, I think that could be seen as an argument to say that fundamentalisms and religions and groupthink and tribalism do end up causing much of the violence. But there are ways around that, especially if you, for example, have a heavenly reward of something sort of, if I do this kind of great earthly act and then pro-religion or pro-my religion, I'll then get a reward that's beyond any court, beyond any human authority. That gives that person some kind of a superhuman, almost, moral force, where they don't care about what any other judge or police or politician or fellow community leader might say, but they're just off to fulfill that divine mission, which I think can be quite dangerous. So thanks very much for your time listening to me today. I look forward to hearing your views and the views of my colleagues on the panel. Thank you.
Whenever you're ready.
Oh, great. Okay, cool. Hi, everyone. And thanks, AJ, for your introduction. I think they're pretty helpful definitions that we've got to start with. I'll just start by saying that I think that religion through history has often been used as a force for violence in lots of ways. And I think that there's all kinds of ways that religion right now, or that human beings are using religion to justify systems that oppress other people in all kinds of ways. I think particularly in Judaism we've got a tradition that's really patriarchal. There's lots of sexism in Jewish tradition, and so that's something that we in our community struggle with all the time, and there's lots of ways in which the tradition seems to justify violence against women in certain ways. So that's something that's just I'm always struggling with and aware of, just a way in which religion, or Judaism in particular, has a kind of violence can be used to justify violence. And at the same time, religion through history and right now is being used as a force for peace as well. So it's definitely Definitely both of those. And I think that I was grateful that AJ pointed out that it's not just religion that is used for violence, but religion is an institution, like all kinds of other institutions, which can also be used for good and bad. I think particularly of how there's institutions that I think are worse than religion for causing violence. Like, for example, through history we've had institutions of empires and nation states with armies. I think that they've been responsible for a lot more violence. So if you're going to pick on an institution created by human beings that is particularly bad, I'd say religion isn't the worst of those, and it's actually quite good. But there's other institutions that are bad. So I think what I'm interested in doing in my talk is just introducing complexity into the idea of religion and how it's used through history. So I think I'll just start. I mean, it's quite helpful that in the Torah, in the Jewish sacred text, we have a grand sweeping mythology that describes the human experience and traces the human encounter with God through that history. And it starts with the human being having struck by, we have the story of Noah, where there is violence. Human beings commit violence to one another. The story of the Tower of Babel too. There's a rabbinic story told about the Tower of Babel, which is when people built a tower, had one language, and people built a tower as high as possible to compete with the creations of God. And there's a story about the Tower of Babel where as they were building the tower, they didn't. If a brick fell down, they would mourn for the brick, but if a human being died in making the tower, they wouldn't mourn for them. So in Torah we have the story of Abraham coming right after that, and Abraham is the myth or the symbol of the human being as a meaning seeker, someone who experiences turmoil in their inner life, experiences violence in the world, and seeks some kind of peace, seeks to connect with something beyond in such a way that they can arrive at something peaceful. I mean, Abraham himself in the story embodies this kind of like balance between, it's something that AJ said quite well, that there's examples of religious people who can appeal to a higher authority in order to do things that might be seen as violent by other people. I mean, that's something that happens in the story of Abraham, right? Like Abraham's choice to sacrifice, agreement with God. God says to Abraham, kill your son, and Abraham says yes. And that's an example of Abraham committing a violent act because of being told to by God. So Abraham contains within him both of those things. But the main point about Abraham is about being a seeker, seeking meaning. In Jewish tradition, much later after Abraham, we have Moshe, Moses. And Moses is the great prophet who is given Torah and receives Torah. And the reason why I'm really... And Torah contains within it some really violent stuff, right? It contains within it commands on the Jewish people to attack other people at some point. It contains really nasty, violent stuff in it, as well as Torah being the container for something really wonderful and powerful and peaceful. So what we have is the Torah. The reason why I'm very grateful to having Torah is because it means that I don't have to be Abraham and start all over again. I don't have to encounter the world and have an experience and start from the very beginning of like just being with my own experience. Instead, I'm rooted in a deep and old tradition that means that I can kind of like get a head start. I can benefit from other people, other human seekers who are seeking meaning in the world. So I feel really grateful to have Torah for that. But the problem is that once a powerful revelation or a human being's powerful experience with something beyond, once that was written down into Torah, then we have institutions that come up around, for example, a sacred book or around religions, and it's those, I think, that are the root of that can cause a lot of violence. That when you're defended, when institutions are created, people defending them can lead to a kind of violence. So what's so ironic about this is that we human beings have conflict with one another and we have our internal struggles, and so we seek peace. We seek to connect beyond to something else that can help bring us that peace. And the irony is that we're then still the people, that we then create institutions to enable those teachings to be passed on, but we're still the people in those institutions who are struggling with their inner turmoil and who are prone to conflict sometimes. So we have this like paradoxical situation at the end. Yeah. So we have a paradoxical situation of religion being both. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you very much. That was great.
Hi everyone. So I'm actually grateful for previous two speakers for sort of saying that this is a complex topic, because when I saw this question I was like, yes, this is not just a complex topic, it's a huge one. It's basically history. The question is, has religion, and I thought it is, so there's always sort of a hint to double check the question before you answer it and prepare your plan. When we're looking at history and looking at peace and looking at violence and looking at religion, like AJ said, there's a lot of concepts there that I think we're probably going to spend most of the day unpacking, and I'm actually quite excited to do that with you guys. Firstly, from my experience, I know that stuff tends to get reported when it's exciting. Stuff tends to get reported when it's good, when it's bad, when it's something along the lines that is dramatic. And usually violence tends to be more dramatic than peace. And if we're looking at a historical question, and when we look at our historical sources, I think they're going to overwhelmingly record violence more than they record peace. And I think that's a confirmation bias that most people will agree with. You know, you don't get newspapers saying, look at the peace in this area, look at these people, look at nothing happens. Peace is nothing happening. Peace is the absence of violence. And so it's actually very hard, if not impossible, to measure peace. We can measure violence. We can measure violence in a number of ways. Number of bombs dropped, number of people killed, number of homes destroyed. Do we ever measure number of homes just intact through normal life? Peace is normality for a lot of people in a lot of societies. And it sort of tends to go unmeasured. So we have to be wary of that confirmation bias. But there's a complexity of things in itself. We talk about religion, and both speakers have talked about institutions of religion. But what about individuals? If I'm a religious person, does every act of violence I commit, is that because of my religion? Can we say that for an atheist or anybody else, every good, compassionate act or every violent act that they do stems from their atheism? So again, we're not just talking about complexity on a macro level, but also on a micro individual level. How do we discern the cause of something? More often than not, religion is, for a lot of people, a mindset and experience. They might not even be aware themselves of the causes of their actions, which may be grounded in religion or not. And obviously that extends to acts of violence and of peace. And as Rabbi said over here, I think we do need to compare religion with other things. And actually, when we look at history, there tends to be an example of labeling religion on acts that actually have other causes. So, for example, the partition of India into Hindu India and Muslim Pakistan, we could say on the face of it, prima facie, that might be something to do with religion, a religious conflict. For me and for a lot of historical scholars, that's imperialism. That's British imperialism coming and drawing a line on a map. If you look up so much conflict that goes on in the continent of Africa, or you look at so many divisions in America, just look at how many states in the world were drawn by rulers on maps, by colonial powers. And then when you have conflict stemming from that, how can we attribute that cause solely to religion or not? We don't know. It might be ethnic, it might be tribal. And then again, this is very interesting. I'm a Sikh. In our religion, we don't have a word for religion. There's no word. There's a word for religion. There's a direct translation in French and Spanish in colonial European languages. But if you go to Indian languages, there's no direct word for religion. The closest you might come to is the word dharma or dharma, which a lot of people will say actually means righteousness. And again, so it's about our whole framing of religion. Do we, as Sikhs, for example, see ourselves as a nationality, as a nation, or as a religion? For a lot of people in the West, it's very hard, and Western scholars who look at the Sikh people from afar through a Western lens are actually very confused, and it's because it's a confusing thing. And so we're looking at all of these events through history, we're looking at all of this stuff, we're looking at things that happened, and we're trying to measure it against things that didn't happen. You know, the notable thing about peace is that it's peaceful, nothing happens. And I think it's very hard to gauge the significance of long periods of peace in times and in places that actually, you know, we might not have for something like war. If you look at the 20th century, for example, World War I, World War II, the Cold War, these are all about either nation states competing with each other, for various things. Or if you look at the Cold War in particular, which engulfed literally the entire world, it was about competition of ideas, the supremacy of ideas, but namely economic ideas. If I'm a religious person, am I responsible for what somebody of my religion does? Look at capitalism today, which essentially governs the world order. You have people starving in continents. Only yesterday the UN came out with a report on Yemen and how many people are going to starve there. The wealth of the world's 10 richest people, if distributed to these people, would solve the world of hunger. Does that make everybody who identifies as a capitalist complicit in the violence against all these people, the hundreds of thousands of people that every single week are dying of hunger? So again, like I said, with a lot of people, there's a lot to unpack here. But these are sort of things that I wanted to sort of throw at you. So I'm sorry if it's a little bit intense. But these are the sort of things I really want to discuss and get into with you guys. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's great. And the last speaker, thank you whenever you're ready.
Well, first I'll say hello and thank you to the Politics and Debating Society for inviting me, to my fellow panelists for contributing to this interesting debate, no doubt. When I first heard this title, I initially misread it and thought it said, has religion been the main cause of violence or peace? Considering the overwhelming majority of wars throughout human history were caused primarily by rather mundane and irreligious human motivations of conquest, plunder, anger, greed, envy, jealousy, vanity, or glory, I thought the title rather an easy one. But today's debate is not about what causes the most violence or peace in the world, nor is today's debate about whether religions are mostly pacifist or not. I'm sure many here would support and justify, when asked, the violence that defeated the Nazi regime in World War II. The question today is whether, if we removed all other factors and looked at religion by itself, and by religion, I'm going to now maybe delineate it as a belief system in something that is greater than just materialistic, the material world or materialistic world, what is just tangible, directly tangible. If we looked at religion, we would see its if we remove all the factors and we looked at religion by itself, would we see its main effect on humanity to be wanton violence, or does it aim towards and has successfully caused peace and stability for a great deal of human history? For most of the history of religion, I think most religions have served two functions. Firstly, they've helped restrain and or limit violence against the purely cynical motivations of people or politicians who hold material or worldly interests. So, for example, in medieval Europe, a lot of these lords and feudal rulers and kings wanted to hit each other, destroy each other, kill each other, burn crops and rape and pillage, but the church enforced what was called a Pax Dei, which is to say that you shouldn't kill non-combatants, you should restrict if you must engage in violence, even though you might view it beneficial to destroy crops and terrorize your enemy to win in a kind of total war, you shouldn't. It's against God's teachings. If you must engage in sin, at least spare the weak and those who are not fighting, which helped to restrict a lot of the violence that happened during the Dark Ages in Western Europe. Also the same with both, I would say, Islam and Judaism's rules of warfare as well. So just war, the idea of just war, who can be fought, when are they fought, and who should not be fought, most importantly, because in the ancient world there was no restrictions in many cultures or many areas of the world as to who could be attacked. Women and children and civilians were generally, there was no immunity as we think there are today. So religion introduced those things, and we are now kind of living on that heritage. I'm going to make a point maybe during the Q&A, but even terrorists of various different religions acknowledge that what they're doing is going outside their religion, but they make an argument from a kind of cynical pragmatism, saying, oh, the enemy do this to us, so we have to do the same back to them. And please question me on that as well. I've got some interesting evidences on that to show quotations from terrorists themselves regarding this. The second function of religion is that religions have generally aimed to create stability and peace for individuals in society. And if religion didn't create peace and stability, why would any state ever adopt it or patron it? If you want to look at it from a purely cynical perspective, rulers would adopt religion because it's helpful to maintaining peace and stability amongst their subjects, to stop them killing each other, or when the state is not looking, for example. Indeed, yeah, very good.
Yeah. I think that's a very good point you just raised. Can you therefore say that any ruler could use religion, which can you can use religion to kind of almost blackmail people into doing a certain act, if it be good or bad, but therefore couldn't that be used as to do something bad?
Sure. If the ruler is the point of reference for the religion, then yes. But if the ruler is not the point of reference for religion, I mean, the Tanakh, the Quran, or the New Testament are not the British government, right? So if the British government want to make an argument from these books, they have to appeal to an interpretation, but people can access these books independently of the government. And so just to continue, so religion has actually been the foundation of rule of law. We've seen this. Now, when we talk about religion, we always talk about the most recent 1,000 years. Well, let's talk about 10,000 years. Let's go to the law code of Hammurabi, where Hammurabi described he was called upon by God to rule with righteousness in the land, so that the strong should not harm the weak, and so that the law should further the well-being of mankind. So he was based on his religious beliefs to create a rule of law which was linked to religion, because people wouldn't just follow some guy who just says it. They want to see that it has some metaphysical basis behind it. And because remember, justice and law don't exist. You can't see them in a microscope. They're not physical existence. They have a metaphysical existence. What about the religions of ancient China, or the people of the Indus Valley, or the Romans and the Greeks? No one ever considers their religions to be causing war. Usually these religions again function to console the individual citizens about the hereafter, about the big questions in life that concern them and cause them stress. And indeed much of, let's say, Chinese philosophy and its belief of the mandate of heaven was about creating balance on earth and not creating violence, and creating peace and stability. That was very much a focus, and this worked for thousands of years. We can't just say, no, let's just look at the last 1,000 years. And remember, if we want to look at, I mean, we can discuss it in the Q&A regarding Catholics and certain Muslim issues and so on and so forth in modern day. And I want to do that, but obviously time is limited. But what I would say, and what I would finish with, is that religion, its function is to tell you to do things which are actually counterintuitive. If you're fighting against enemy, don't use total war to defeat them. But from a material perspective, from a materialistic perspective, you might think, well, maybe you should use total war to defeat the enemy. Maybe you should engage in like Winston Churchill approved strategic bombing of German cities, just civilians in those cities, because he thought it would bring the war effort closer to an end, where even though religious leaders decried that tactic. You need religion to do these counterintuitive things, because mercy and forgiveness is counterintuitive to people who are purely materialistic and Machiavellian mindsets. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was really good. So yeah, I think we've had really good speakers, and you've each delivered great speeches, ranging from ideas such as institutions, confirmation bias, the difference between a state and an individual person's acts and how that might differ, and then looking at the multiplicational factors that influence any individual or state's act, whether it be selfish greed or religion being the influence there.
I think we should just open up to the floor. Does anyone have any questions to go back to them? And you guys can go.
Feel free to ask each other questions as well. This is an opportunity to address any issues that we thought were raised here. Any questions we had previously, before we came into this debate, just on the topic itself in general. So yeah, feel free to direct them at the speakers if you guys have any.
Don't be shy. Anyone got any points?
You said that the terrorists went beyond their religion.
Yes.
And you had quotes. Yeah, can you quote them, please?
Okay. All right, well, I'll put into context. So basically, people often believe that, and you hear it cited quite a lot by government and certainly politicians, they want to portray insurgencies as motivated by religion because it absolves them from any particular blame as to cause and effect in this. So they say that, well, the people in the Middle East just hate us or hate the West, whatever, just because we're the West and we live free and so on and so forth, when you never see these particular groups raging out against South America, for example, who are also liberal, and they also have what you might call Western freedoms, or that interpretation of freedoms. You never see South America be the target of let's say, anger in the Middle East. Now, it doesn't mean that anyone is justified in their method, of course, but what it does show is that these are political causes and political effects, nothing to do with religious interpretation. In fact, before I quote, and I'll give you one quote because we're not going to hear all day, but if to quote John Locke, the famous classical philosopher John Locke. So he was responding to the claim that some Protestants and Catholics just hate England because their religion tells them to hate England. Back then, England was Protestant, and there was issues with that, right? So he said it's not one's particular interpretation or church, as he called it, one particular religion or belief that incites one to seditious commotion but oppression. So what he said, so John Locke said, saying that the Catholics don't hate England because their Catholicism makes them do so, or they read in the Bible that they have to hate England or the King of England or what have you, but rather it's how they were treated in England that makes them motivated to do into seditious commotion, into actions which are what would be probably against Catholicism, basically. So he said it's oppression which causes a reaction to it, not religious interpretation. Likewise, there was I'm going to give you just one quote. I'm not going to hog the time, but so Osama bin Laden was asked. He was asked about why his war against the West, or more specifically America, but why his war generally against the West, and more specifically why he used the tactic of targeting Western civilian targets. So the Al Jazeera interviewer was a Muslim, and so asked him, how can you justify this, considering that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ prohibited the targeting of innocent civilians? So this interview was in 2004, by the way, if you want to reference it up. And he said, you're right, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ did prohibit the targeting of civilians, and this is narrated in authentic traditions of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. So the Al Jazeera interviewer was baffled by this, saying, yeah, well, exactly then, so how can you justify it? And then to which bin Laden responded, well, it's not set in, the law isn't set in stone. He argued that if the West doesn't feel shy to attack our civilians, we should respond in like manner to prevent them from continuing to attack our civilians. So we should respond and copy the West. So he did not copy the Prophet Muhammad, not copy some verse in the Quran. His argument was you have to copy the West in dealing with what he perceived with his perceived grievances. It wasn't a religious argument or interpretation. He argued that the Prophet Muhammad's law is no longer is not useful here, and he's going to go outside it because he thinks in his mind it's an exception. And why I hate when people call it fundamentalism is because he's not a fundamentalist. Any Muslim who follows the fundamentals of Islam knows that it is an absolute prohibition to target enemy civilians or non-combatants or even unjust warfare generally. And there is no ifs or buts or exceptions because you think it's beneficial. What's the point of religion if you can abrogate if you think it's not beneficial anymore to your Machiavellian motivations? So this is one. I have exact quotations. Also, and this is really funny, he also said to an ABC reporter, he said that look, if the West leaves us alone, we leave the West alone. Live and let live. Would you believe he actually said that? Live and let live. That was his argument. But if it was motivated by religion just to hate the infidels, then he wouldn't say live or let live. He wouldn't say every time he gets asked why he fighting the West, he cites grievances of Western invasions, Western bombing, Western propping up of puppet rulers and dictators, and of course of his grievance against the Israeli state. These are the issues that he cites, not religion. Not he opened up the Quran and says go forth and kill every non-Muslim, because it doesn't exist in the Quran. And Osama bin Laden will admit that. So that's why that was my quotation I had. I have a few more, but we can. I'll let someone else speak as well.
Could I come back on some of those points?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, because I mean, I agree with that. A lot of the stuff that you said in your presentation, Abdullah, and some of the points that you made there. But I think some were veering a bit too much towards a black and white sort of religion has nothing to do with the kind of position, which I don't think is tenable by reality. I mean, claiming that Osama bin Laden was not a fundamentalist, for example, or that, quote, he was only copying the West. I think this is, despite the legitimate grievance, and I'm very familiar with the political background to Western intervention in the Middle East, and I don't want to put that aside, I want to keep that there, but even with legitimate grievances, I don't think you can get away from the fact that the tool they pick up to attack the West or to gather their supporters to attack the West, the tool is religion, right? And if religion has a fundamental weakness, which I think it does, one of the weaknesses, as I said, it transcends the individual critical thinking. It says you, the German, a potential Muslim convert, or you in prison, in the UK, come over to Islam, don't think, we'll think for you. Again, like you said, there's no critical thinking in Islam. What's the point of religion if you can critically think for yourself? Forget all of that. Come and join us and get on the bandwagon and do whatever we say. I'm not saying you can have both. You can't. It's not mutually exclusive. You can have legitimate grievances against the West, and also you can misuse religious principles, because there are these inherent weaknesses. I mean, Islam was spread by violence in the early period of Islam. Whether then you say, well, it was only because it was prisoners of war were taken and there were these, exceptions, and Muhammad was actually much less violent than people that went before him. These caveats can be given, but to say that it's only a reaction to monkey see, monkey do, I don't think is quite borne out by the facts.
Well, I respond quite easily. When people say, well, you shouldn't say religion has nothing to do with it. Religion in this area, in this effect, only has to do with it in terms of as an identity group, or rather identity group solidarity. So Osama bin Laden sees Muslims who he identifies as his group being bombed and killed, and because he states that he has a problem with that, he hates that, he doesn't like to see his people being attacked and killed from what he claims. So he believes that he should do what he feels necessary, even go outside of Islam, which I disagree with, of course, to defend his in-group. So it's not, if you want to say, does religion have something to do with it? Well, religion is basically the teachings of a belief system. It's not just an identity group. And you can't, in fact, you can't just say, for example, oh yeah, I'm a Muslim, I don't believe in God, but yeah, I'm a Muslim. Because you embraced the identity group, but you haven't embraced religion. And there's a difference between identity group and religion. So if people didn't identify as religion, they'd fight each other over many, and they indeed do, over many other types of identity, like nationality being the biggest killer of humans in terms of warfare and fighting and intolerance in the world, with nationalism, a secular nationalism. So there's that. Secondly, you said religion doesn't embrace critical thinking, but it's got nothing to do with critical thinking. The problem here,
yes, I agree.
the problem here, well, here's the thing. The problem here is that Osama bin Laden thinks he's engaging what he thinks is critical thinking to abrogate the Islamic laws and say they don't longer apply, because he feels that the only way to gain victory, and he says that, is by going outside the rules of Islam and retaliating against the West in a like manner. This is exactly what he says. So the problem is that he's not blindly following his scriptures. He's decided to go outside of the text and defy the Islamic scriptures. Because the point of scriptures is to tell you to do things which you might not think are beneficial. See, if people just did things which were beneficial and moral at the same time, great, no need for religion. But the problem is, when someone goes out to steal, they steal because they think it's beneficial. If someone goes out to rape or commit murder, that person in their twisted mindset think it's beneficial to their desires. So they desire to do it, so they want to satisfy their desire. They think, well, I'm going to do it, might as well, because this is how I get my enjoyment. You need religion to tell you, well, no, this is wrong, you shouldn't do it. There's a higher reason why you shouldn't do it. Otherwise, all you're left with is human desires and getting caught by the state. That's as your only restriction. It's only a sin if you get caught, as some people say.
I think we just have to make sure that we have it relatively balanced. You were making fantastic points, very interesting, but we do need to make sure we get everyone to speak.
Yeah, sure, sorry.
Have a point you'd like to make?
I mean, I just feel, as I listen to Abdullah speaking, it hasn't become clear to me yet whether you're saying that... what I'm hearing what you're saying is partly that someone like Osama bin Laden is distorting Islam.
No, he's admitting himself that he's going outside of Islam.
But you're not saying that he's distorting Islam?
Well, he hasn't brought an interpretation of Islam to justify what he
fine.
does.
So I don't know. I just think that what I'm concerned about as I listen to you speak is... So I don't know, something that that's very precious to me in as a religious person and in my religious tradition is to be really, for me myself, being really honest about the tradition and honest about the ways in which its Judaism every day helps me to live more peacefully, and it helps me to feel more connected with the bigness, with divinity. It helps me to understand, as I study Jewish texts, what my obligations are to the others, what my obligations are to all human beings, what my obligations are to my fellow Jews. Religion really helps me to understand those, and those help me to try and bring some more peace into the world. But in order to do that, I have to also say about some of my co-religionists, and I have cousins of mine who are what I would call fundamentalist Jews, and I listen to them, and I listen to the Torah that they teach, and it really shocks me and disturbs me, and it makes me feel angry, and it makes me feel sad, and I listen to them, and I realise that what they're saying, these cousins of mine who are religious extremists, I listened to them and I realised that what they're saying is a reading of Judaism, and I have to, and it's a reading of Judaism that I think does lead to violence, and I have to listen to that, and I can't tell them that that's not Judaism, but I can say definitively that it's not my Judaism, and that Judaism is a Judaism that leads to violence, and I, please God, will be teaching as a rabbi a Judaism that can help lead to more peace. And I'm really troubled by I would be troubled by anyone. It goes back to how AJ started this whole debate about really wanting to kind of go into the grey area between these. I'm troubled by anyone who's not able to see both of those things and to say that actually there's some stuff that's disturbing in the tradition and some stuff that's really loving and bringing peace.
Okay, well, if I may defend Orthodox Judaism.
I wasn't referring to Orthodox Judaism, by the way.
Oh, ultra-Orthodox? Or which branch?
I don't know if it's relevant to go into that.
Oh, okay. I mean, look, I'll just give you an example. So, there's actually quite a lot of very interesting rules and laws in the Tanakh concerning ultra-Orthodox, Orthodox interpretations. So, for example, in the Kingdom of Israel, they didn't believe that they should kick out all Israelites or non-Israelites, from the land of Canaan, but rather that there's actually rules for living peacefully with Gentiles amongst the Israelites and respecting them and not taking their property and not taking, if they have a land, not taking their land, and having this really peaceful coexistence with people who live amongst the Israelites but are not Israelites themselves. So this was really good. But in today's world of nation states, where a state is based around a nation, but then what decides the character of a nation, whose nation, what nation, which ethnic group, which heritage, which background, these debates lead to out-groups and in-groups within different nation states. And I refer to all kinds of countries, from England, from the rise of the far right in the West, to United States, and so on and so forth. This in-group, out-group. Who defines what American values is? Is it white Americans? Is it black Americans? Is it all Americans? But then if it's all Americans, then why are, let's say, Muslim Americans and 50 years ago, Jewish Americans not allowed or perceived as being a fifth column or a danger to the American values? And before that, even Catholics were also concerned. They were concerned against Catholics in America as well about. They're also saying they said they were fifth column and so on and so forth. So we see with nation states, you always have these minority ethnic groups being persecuted, being discriminated against, because in the era of nation state, what defines the nation? And to also kind of agree with my colleague here, Suk, is in India, the persecution against Christians, against Sikhs as well as against Muslims is not because some Hindus opened up their books and said, "Oh yes, I have to persecute non-Hindus." No, it's not a religious interpretation. It's the era of nation-state supremacy. Whose India is it? Who defines it? Whose heritage? And they say, well, Islam, Christianity, Sikhism, these came much later on. True Hindus are those who follow the ancient religions of the Indus Valley. Of course, you could go back and say, well, actually, the Dravidians were the ones who had their religion first, and then the northern. But anyway, obviously, nationalism doesn't make any sense. If you go back far enough, you can refute any claim to authority. But my point is this: secular politics produces the kind of things you saw in the 20th century, with nation states, with persecutions of minorities who are deemed to be against the majority or a danger to the fundamental values of the nation. And also immigration is also a concern about people who are also nationalists, saying, oh, my nation is being changed by these immigrants, even though they're equal citizens. But no, these are immigrants or the sons of immigrants, and they're going to change my nation. So my point was this, is that religion doesn't cause this kind of discord. Discord is caused in the world of modern secular and in some cases liberal politics. And I'll get into the issue about some issues of secular liberalism a bit later.
Okay. Thank you very much, guys. If anyone has any questions, please fire away.
Sure, I'll just follow up. Given everything you said in the previous question, why do you think Islam itself has been more often than not associated with violence in the past decade or so? Okay,
well, it's pretty straightforward. If you were, let's say, coming to England in 1600s, and you asked them, what kind of religions do you think are violent? They'd say to you, oh, Catholics. Catholics are violent. they create. Look at the terrorism. Look at, well, if you go 1666, the Great Fire of London, they blamed it on Catholics. Even one Catholic guy even came and admitted that it was him who did it, for example. And that was the 9/11 of London, you know, the Great Fire of London, right? What's it called? The 5th of November, the 5th of November, the gunpowder plot by Guy Fawkes. Catholic, what was he protesting against? Against persecution and discrimination against Catholics in the UK. So if you went there, the Protestant would tell you, oh yeah, Catholics, they're just prone to violence, right? And when you, or if you were during the Cold War in the 60s and 70s, and you ask, well, who are like the violent groups in the world? Some people would say, well, we see South Americans, oh yeah, South Americans, they're very violent, a lot of terrorist groups down there, terror attacks against America by South American terror groups and things like this. So, okay, but who's interfering in South America? It's not South Africa that's interfering in South America, right? It's United States. And the South Americans didn't like being interfered with, didn't like to have CIA-sponsored coups, death squads, CIA propped up dictatorships, and so on and so forth. And so they reacted in a number of ways. Some thankfully formed majority peaceful movements. What they call there was this liberation theology. There was a Christian liberation theology. That's why religion was used positively to create a liberation theology, a non-violent liberation theology. But others went outside of religion and engaged in terror activities. So in this day and age, when you have, Britain in the last 100 years has invaded Iraq 5 times. I often make the common joke that Britain has invaded Iraq so many times that you should get a reward card. All right, next time's free. Yeah. United States has military bases all over the Middle East, and I don't think the people in the Middle East actually are quite happy with these military bases, including the fact that America has pretty much attacked most countries in the Middle East, save its allies, like Saudi Arabia and so on. So anyway, if you look at the situation where you see outside pressure and outside intervention, which is military and of a violent nature, unfortunately you see some individuals going outside of religion and reacting with the same similar violent nature.
But you also say that in freedom and planets it has nothing to do with religion. And what do you talk about? People who use religion as a cause for violence. So in the UK, those who call for jihad, or those who actually use the name of Islam for their actions. Are you basically saying that they have nothing to do with Islam, doing it outside of Islam, or they misconvening the meaning of what Islam teaches?
If you could just reply briefly.
Okay. What I often say this. If an atheist sees an injustice, an atheist will say, this is an injustice according to me. Right? If a theist sees an injustice, say, this is also an injustice. But it's injustice which I think is backed up by a divine basis. But the injustice could be exactly the same. Someone could be raped, and both the atheist and theist will see the same rape happening and say, this is an injustice. But the atheist will say, this is an injustice according to my personal values. And the theist will say, this is an injustice according to my religious beliefs. But they're both saying and talking about the same thing. So religion really, the question that we're discussing here is, if religion, we took it all away, would the world be any different? Would it be a more peaceful world? I argue no, it wouldn't. Because people would fight over the same things, maybe even worse because there'd be no restraints.
Okay, thank you.
No, you can carry on, I don't mind.
Sure?
Yeah.
I think Jen found his hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask the panel, just to anyone who wants to respond, I think that, can you really argue that we can have a peaceful world with religion? Because I think all of the central scriptures of all of the monotheistic religions have a predisposition to fascism. Islam claims it's the final solution. There's no religion after Islam. It's the last and final one. I think that gives a really dangerous precedent, and it also, the thing about Islam is it tells you what to eat. It tells you, Islam is totalitarian in the fact it tells you what to eat, what to wear, what you do. It dictates your entire existence to you. So I think that Judaism, for instance, they're God's chosen people. I think all of these central scriptures do have a predisposition to fascism, and they tell the followers of those believers that they have some sort of superiority over the people outside of their religion. And I think, yeah, you can reinterpret the scripture and say, actually, if you look at this bit, they say, love your neighbour or whatever, but how can you forget the other central bits that are so focused on violence? How can you just disregard that? There's no higher body telling you what is and isn't right within a religious text, if you know what I mean. So it's only up to personal preference. And I think without getting rid of the entire scripture, you can't really sorry if I phrased it really badly, but I don't think there's any way of doing it. I still have these central scriptures in place.
I think that's an interesting point. I think also you talk about, in your opinion, religious texts and their predisposition to, you say, fascism and therefore violence. There's not a single constitution of any state in the world that doesn't govern violence, that doesn't say anything about violence. And I think I say that because it brings us to a point about to create something peaceful, to sustain peace, you necessarily need violence. You need not just rules on violence. If you prohibit somebody from committing violence and you do it through a legal instrument, by nature of prohibiting somebody, you are also allowing somebody else, right? You're also legitimizing some form of violence. And I think something that hasn't been discussed on the panel yet, and something I'm very happy to get into, is that everybody would say that there are both legitimate and illegitimate forms of violence. The Western nation state, from Western philosophical thought, defines the state as that which has a monopoly on legitimate violence. The state, as it is conceived through the sort of Western canon of political thought, necessarily places all of that legitimacy in the nation state. So the police can exercise violence, either to restrain me or to shoot somebody or to do stuff. And when that happens, generally, we say that's fine, we accept it. And actually, the interesting thing is that we don't choose to be part of a nation state. If you're born in a nation state, you don't choose to be part of that. And this is all sort of social contract theory and political philosophy and so on and so forth. But it's interesting you say that they have a predisposition to violence, because I think that, for example, the Sikhs, not our central text, but the Sikh tradition does govern violence. We do have laws on what violence is legitimate, what violence is illegitimate. That's just political theory. That is a political theory. That's a political theory of how a society should operate and how it should be governed and who does the governing. But so does Britain, so does America. America's crazy. America lets anybody have a gun, right? Look at the violence that basically anybody can go out and buy a gun. If you want to see a predisposition to violence that's embedded in a constitution, America, which is supposedly the world's greatest democracy, go to America and you talk to their politicians, you talk to their political theorists, they will say that they have the best political system in the world. They will quote checks and balances. They will quote the Supreme Court, which, by the way, is now tipping in favor of one ideological position, probably because a guy on it committed sexual violence. So we look at this sort of stuff. I personally would disagree with your interpretation of the religious text, but I'm saying that that's actually not even the point in a lot of ways, because it extends to a bigger point about, let's actually have a discussion about who should legitimize violence. If you want peace, you have to have rules on violence. And to have rules on violence, you need to put it in the hands of somebody so that they can maintain the peace, but also because that's just what happens when you say that some people can't have it.
Should we move on to everyone gets a chance to reply to that question?
Yeah, I'd love.
First, then we can.
What's your name, by the way? Sorry.
John.
Yeah, I'd love to reply to your question. It's a great question. So I think I'll start by responding about how we use our sacred text, right? How do we read our sacred text? So someone could go along to a bookshelf and get off the Hebrew Bible and open the Torah and read verses in the Torah. And there's like verses in the Torah that like command there's command to commit violent acts, right? There's like some really unpleasant, difficult stuff in Torah that like really that I find really disturbing. Like, and your language for them is like fascist tendencies, right? That's what you said. Yeah. So if you were to, but the thing is, as Jews, that's not how we read the Torah, right? Torah for us is not. We don't go to a book and like the Torah tells us what to do. For us, Torah study is a practice, right? So so you can't just. It's not like one Jew is not going to read Torah and then just say, this is what it says, therefore we must do this. In my community, I would engage in a practice of Torah study, where we'd open the text, look at it with commentators, read it together with other people. I teach a practice of reading Torah where, as we read it, we're attentive to what feelings it brings up in us, what connections this particular text might make with other things going on in the world, and what our experience out in the world and our experience of people's stories that we hear out in the world, what insight does that bring to what we bring to the text, and how does that change what we might understand that text is commanding us to do. So often this leads to what I would call preaching against the text, right? Where in the studying of a Torah text, using the rabbinic methods of how to study a Torah text, I might end up saying something that seems to disagree with the simple meaning of the text, but actually within the context of the practice of Torah study, it's actually engaging with that in a deep way. We'd have to do it sometime for me to really explain what that means. Technically, this is called hermeneutics, right? What I'm describing, right? How do you read religious texts? You don't just read them like a law book. That's the one thing. Second thing is you commented on the idea of, for example, a problem with religion that you pointed out is that religions claim to be the last word, that there can't be any. It's like there can't be an acceptance of the possibility that other people can be right as well, and that's a problem. Weirdly and paradoxically, because it's quite hard to understand this, in Judaism, the notion of the kind of doctrine of the chosen people, the Israel having been chosen in some way, the word chosen isn't a good translation of that. Really what it means is that we're particular, right? So we have an understanding that our way of being in the world is being in the world through the practice of Torah, and that Torah is something that we have as Jews, and that doesn't belong to other people. So what that weirdly means is that we don't have universal claims to the truth. We don't think that our truth is the truth for other people. So that's very different to. I mean, I just realised that actually there's no Christians on the panel, and weirdly, because we're in a Western post-Christian society or secularized Christian society, the language and the terminology that we're using, like for example, even the idea of religion, is a Christian idea. So it's kind of strange. And in Christianity, for much of Christianity's history, there was the idea of Christianity as universal, right? Of Christianity going out, and other people should also be Christian. We don't have that in Judaism.
Okay, thank you. Do you want to?
Yeah, I'd like to respond to this. I appreciate and I sort of sympathise with where you're coming from. This idea that religions do have to make very, very grand gestures, absolutist, pronouncements, in order to get people's attention and get them on board. I think it does. I think it comes from more of a naive place, personally, rather than like a cynical way to sort of try and get people into a warlike mode to take over the world for their religion. I think it's done to, as we said earlier, and I think it's quite revealing, quote, people won't just follow some guy. You need to have some kind of fairy dust on it. You need to have some kind of grand being somewhere to judge you or to give you some superpowers, or here's a miracle, here's some fish out of my basket, something to sort of get your attention to follow my ideas rather than the other guy's ideas. If you see Monty Python and the Life of Brian, you sort of see this where they're walking down in Jerusalem, and they're sort of every few yards there's a box with a guy standing on it preaching something. How do you get someone's attention there? So I think that's exactly right. It's very, very revealing. No, critical thinking is very, very controlled. You join the bandwagon. You just see what the group wants you to see. And if there is a problem, I think unfortunately we have this tendency, and we've seen it here again tonight, is to engage in the no true Scotsman fallacy, which to explain is, if no true Muslim or no true Hindu or no true Christian would do this, even though they are saying they're doing it, they're using the symbols of the religion to do it, they're quoting from the religion to do it, but no, it's the wrong interpretation. They're going quote unquote outside the rules of the religion. Well, religion is defined by what people do. Irshad Manji, who's a Muslim, she's a gay Canadian Muslim, who has written on this a lot and talked to scholars all over the world, including people ex-Muslims as well. She would say, and I agree with her, religion is defined by what people do in that era. Islam today is defined by how Muslims, self-identifying Muslims, do or how they behave in this era today. And unfortunately, some of them, a minority, yes, are engaging in religious violence, both physical and ideological and rhetorical, in the name of Islam. And any other religion. In India, we have the BJP, a fundamentalist Hindutva party, which is trying to propose that as a kind of, again, imperialistic or dominating ideology over the other Dravidians we mentioned earlier, over the other cultures in India. And that has to be owned. If I'm a Hindu, I have to own that and say, like Daniel said, that's not my Hinduism, that's not my Islam, it's their Islam. But I think it's quite patronizing, and it's quite problematic, and it goes more towards the black and white, there is only one Islam, it's the Islam of peace, that's fundamentalism. It goes, and on the other side, you have other people, you know, al-Baghdadi, for example, who are saying there is only one Islam, and that's the Islam in which I'm the caliphate. We mentioned earlier that it's a problem when the leader, sorry, let me just get this here, when the political leader is identified with the religion, you know, when the ruler is a point of reference for the religion. Well, what's a caliph if not a, you know, in the history of Islam, who is a religious leader, who's a point of reference for the religion, and if he turns out to be a crackpot, then, you know, you're going to have trouble. Some people weren't crackpots. You know, there's a lot of caliphs who did a lot of good things. The Ottoman Empire had much, you know, and I can accept that because I'm looking for the nuance. I can accept the liberation theology nuance that religion can sometimes do good, but what I can't accept is just, you know, 20th century secular nation states were responsible for, you know, the wars that we saw in the 20th century, or that you know, materialistic, rationalistic philosophy and you know, secular democracy has led to populism, which leads to immigrant hatred. No, I'm sorry. There's also religious, you know, inputs into that as well. Again, it's when people have it. Human nature predisposes to hatred, to tribalism, to in-group, out-group dynamics, and human nature can pick up various tools to inflict that upon other people. And one of the tools they can pick up is religion. And if you deny that, then that's problematic, right? I'm prepared to accept one of the tools they pick up is science, is Marxism, is atheism, Mao, whatever. That's one of the tools they can pick up to bash their enemies with. Another tool is religion, right? I think we have to see the nuance in that. We have to accept both of that. If we just say religion is only proposing anti-Machiavellian moral ideas and everything that's wrong is just some sort of corruption of religion, if only religion was allowed to have the straight path, we'd be okay. I think we're in a lot of trouble if we start going down that road.
Okay.
Yeah.
May I have a tiny bit of latitude, because a lot of things are mentioned about Islam in that, quite a lot, and I think a lot of misconceptions. The Caliph is not a spiritual leader at all whatsoever. He's purely a political leader. He doesn't represent Islam. In fact, he can be deposed if he goes outside of Islam. So he doesn't determine what Islam is at all. It's not a pope. We don't have a clergy. We don't have a church. So that's completely wrong in the first place. That's a basic fact. You should know this. What about the no true? Well, just go Wikipedia. You can see it for yourself. It's not a like a hidden fact or so on. We don't have a church. We don't have a pope. We're not Catholic Christianity.
Yeah, I agree. We don't have a clergy, but the caliph has a religious insignificance.
No, he has the authority to implement the political laws of Islam. That's it.
Okay, can we let this one speak at time?
Yeah. No true Scotsman fallacy. Well, okay, I would accept. That would be a good argument unless Osama bin Laden in this case admitted he wasn't a true Scotsman. So if he himself admits that he's not following the teaching of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, then I think we can accept that it doesn't fall foul of your no true Scotsman fallacy when the guy admits he's not a true Scotsman in this matter, right? If he says he's going outside the realms of the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam because he thinks it's more beneficial from a pragmatic perspective to do so, I think it's safe to say he's not following an interpretation of Islam. By his own admission. There's two verses in the Quran I would like to read out for those who want to, for all the fundamentalists in the audience. Let there be no compulsion in religion, truth stands out clear from error. A second verse, and this actually was a very impactful one. And had your Lord so willed, those on earth would have believed, all of them together. So will you then compel mankind until they become believers? It is not for anyone to believe except by permission of God. So basically the Quran is saying if God had willed it, everyone would have followed the same religion. So if we're seeing people following different religions, this is the will of God, and how can you go against the will of God by trying to compel people to follow a religion? People will only change their religion by the will of God, not by your compulsion or anything you do. This is it's a very clear verse of the Quran. There's no compulsion. Of course people believe, if what's the point of religion or any belief system or any worldview at all whatsoever, if you don't believe it's true? Then why would you be following it in the first place? It's kind of self-evident. I mean, I'm pretty sure Richard Dawkins believes that his worldview is true, and one could argue, he's talked about religion and religious people as cockroaches, I think, if I'm quoting him correctly. I'll double check that. But we certainly know Mao Zedong said religion is poison, and Sam Harris said that there are certain religious doctrines, I'm paraphrasing, certain religious doctrines which he feels are so dangerous it could justify a preemptive strike against them. And if they have the potential of gaining something like nuclear weapons, we should do preemptive strikes, nuclear strikes against such religions, because he feels the doctrines are so dangerous they shouldn't be allowed to exist. And of course, this was the basis of communists when they destroyed or persecuted religious people, because they believed that religion is false consciousness, they said. And why should false consciousness have any right to exist, according to their argument? If it's false, why does it have a right to exist, the communists argued. And that's why they justified, from purely materialistic basis, why we shouldn't tolerate anyone who has any particular religion. He says totalitarian, also the gentleman in the audience talked about totalitarianism and so on. Well, here's the thing. If you're talking about a belief about how you should live in every aspect of your life, then everyone's conscience and everyone's ethics is totalitarian. Because surely you have an ethical system that governs how you live. Whether it's personal just to you or it's a particular religion, everyone believes in a totalitarian ethical system that they apply in every aspect of your life. The question is, do we believe in a state structure that imposes laws in every aspect of life? Well, in Islam says no. We know that from the time of Caliph Omar, which was an example, a companion of the Prophet Muhammad, that people who did sins or crimes, personal crimes like drinking alcohol, and engaging in fornication in the privacy of their own home, the state had no jurisdiction on people's privacy. Right? We didn't have an NRA or whatever no, sorry, not NRA. Sorry, it's the what's the name of that agency that
CIA.
NSA. That's it. Scans people's emails and taps their telephones, see what they're doing inside their house. We didn't believe in that. We don't believe in that. But in modern secular states, well, they do, because if you don't believe in God, then the only all-seeing eye that will look over you to see what you're doing is going to be the state, then, because that's the only thing left to fear once you take God out of the equation. So the state has to become totalitarian to make sure that you're all good citizens and you're all paying your taxes exactly as the upper elite tell you to, usually benefiting their own pockets. So I think that's all I have to say. I'll comment the rest after. But yeah, that's it.
Thank you. We understand that you have a lot of points directed at you, but we just try and keep it.
Of course. Sure.
So we keep the kind of rebuttals now of the director to the speakers short as possible. That way we can cover as many questions as we can and give you guys a fair chance.
Sure.
Very quickly. I just wanted to bring up a couple of points that were made. Earlier on, Abdullah, you mentioned quite an old, how can you be moral without having some kind of backing to it? Your suggestion that humanism or atheism gives exactly the same result as a religious edict. Cherry picking is something, and you alluded to it, Rabbi, cherry picking. There's obviously lots of stuff in the Old Testament especially that is horrible. You could be killed for picking up sticks on the Sabbath and for eating shellfish and mixing fibres. It's ridiculous. Why would you follow that kind of stuff? And the point I'm making is we don't need to. The International Humanist and Ethical Union has created a global humane way for us all to live. You can read it. It works quite well. We bring our humanist views to bear on religious stuff. So when we read religious texts that say things that are horrible or old-fashioned or weird, we just ignore it. We only follow the stuff that happens to back up what we want to do, like the Golden Rule. And one other point I want to make, and that is something you brought up right at the beginning, which is very important. There's a great book written by Steven Pinker called The Better Angels of Our Nature. Some of you guys may have read it. It's brilliant. It's all about how the world's a better, happier and safer place than it ever has been over whatever period of time and wherever you look. Because you're right, news, there will always be enough killings to fill the news. We are only 15% of the world's population are at or below starvation level now. That's the lowest percentage there has ever been in human history. The fact that it's over 1.5 billion people is slightly uncomfortable for those individuals, but as a percentage it's much lower than it ever has been. So a couple of points that I thought worth making.
We just have one person go back on each point just to keep it a bit brief because time's getting on. So Daniel, I think you were reacting to the first point, so if you want to go back on that.
Sorry, did I make you laugh?
This is really funny because it's just funny because I don't know what you when you were talking about cherry picking. Weird, because I don't think that's the stuff that you've said is. There's quite a few things to respond to that.
Can I just come in slightly before that? I think I'm on the same train of thought as you as well. I want to pick up on something, it ties into what Abdullah was saying as well. And I take the point that in theory, again, going back to the hermeneutics, religion can be practiced in theory, as in like the ideal way to do it, the way it's meant to be done. Again, going back to my quote initially, you know, Marx was not a Marxist, Jesus was not a Christian. He didn't envisage the whole grandeur of the Vatican and the gold and the, you know, livery in the church and, you know, oh, look at me. He said, it's going to be easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to get into heaven. You know, but the actual practicing of the Christianity is quite far from that. So in that similar way, I think in religious texts, there's a lot of good things, and I agree, and I'm familiar with that quote where it says, let there be no compulsion in religion. I love that quote in the Quran, and I love the massive history of scholars and who have interpreted it in very, very loving ways. Sufism, for example, you know, in Sunni and Shia sects of Islam, there's a lot to like about it, and I'm very proud of that being a human, you know, creation, it's a civilizational thing coming from my own country of India. There's a proud tradition of that, but unfortunately, the way in theory it's meant to be practiced by, you know, very sincere academics and scholars, you know, and religious rulers, it's one thing, but the person on the street or the person standing up al-Baghdadi, you know, getting video recorded saying I am the caliph and using the words of Islam, the symbology of Islam, in however a wrong interpretation by majority versus minority standards or by law, you know, scholarly refutations, and there have been a lot of scholars who refuted him point by point, and I accept all of that. But the point is, if we're going to say religion as a whole, it has these good parts, it has these bad parts, you can't just say the bad parts don't belong in the religion, or you can say I would rather they don't belong in the religion. In theory, in hermeneutics, when you read a text while being self-aware, while being humble, you know, while accepting that there are, you know, sound hadiths, not so sound hadiths, you know, there's a bit of discrepancy here, which a lot of good scholars do, but unfortunately human nature is, you know, I want fast food service, I want my, you know, fatwa now, rather than, you know, tomorrow. When I come back and, you know, tomorrow and we'll consider this, that's not, unfortunately, the crisis that we're in, and I would, as a religious person, be aware of that. And again, I'd rather be honest and accept the nuance rather than sort of try and paper over it and sort of point to, you know, political grievances, point to imperialism, point to, you know, copying the West.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, what's your name, by the way?
Steve.
Steve. And are you within a humanist framework, is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay, so I got quite a simple thing to say then, is that just to invite humanists and others to be really careful about the ideas that you're buying into. So for example, as you were talking, you said the Old Testament, you said the Old Testament in particular is known for, I can't remember exactly the words, but like
horrible stuff.
But horrible stuff.
Well,
so
there's some, there's good and horrible stuff.
Totally. So that I hear within that echo, when you're saying that to a Jewish person, echoes of a kind of like long-standing Christian anti-Judaism. So for example, so Christianity for a long time in history understood what they called the Old Testament, which our Bible is not the Old Testament. So my holy book is the Torah, and if in secular language you might call that the Hebrew Bible. The Old Testament is the first part of the Christian Bible. And so when we use Christian anti-Judaism for a couple of millennia has in order to kind of dismiss Judaism, has pointed out to, you know, like the Old Testament is a God of judgment and violence, and the New Testament is where there's love. That's Christian anti-Judaism. So I just invite you to be careful.
I'm Jewish by background, so I think it unlikely that I would be meaning to do that. But there's crap in the New Testament as well. Jesus saying, "Bring your parents to me and kill them in front of me." There's all sorts of horrible stuff in everything. But what I'm inviting us all to do is ignore it all. We can be humane and human people and be kind to each other. We don't need all of this stuff. Why? Anyway, sorry, I'm getting on my high horse here.
That's all right.
Should we take another question from the audience?
Thank you. Just a very quick response, because...
Very quickly though, if you can.
I totally agree with you. The world's better now than it ever has been on a load of measures, and if I had to pick a time in history to be born statistically, it would be now. The point that I was making was that if you look at how much wealth and all the rest of it there is in society, it's never been easy to generate wealth. It's never been easy to hoard wealth. It's never been easy to get food in places. And yet we still have so many people dying of hunger unnecessarily in the world. When you look at global wealth, when you even look at wealth distributed between continents. And the point that you said about the media is totally 100% correct. Wherever there are Sikhs, there's something called langar, the practice of giving out free food. I know we took AJ to a Gurdwara a few weeks ago, showed it in action. There's about 7 million meals served by Sikhs, totally free of charge to anybody without any condition whatsoever. We invite absolutely everybody. Never gets media attention. And what we did in the Sikh Press Associations, we had to create, in PR terms, a national Langar week just to sort of get articles about it in local press and in local news. So there's all this sort of stuff. My point was to the original question. When we're looking at sources, when we're looking at the historical sources of things, they're going to be biased towards one thing. They're going to be towards one thing. And so merely the point that I was making is actually there's a lot of stuff happening around that we don't see.
Okay, and just to finish up, small point, before colonialism, North Africa was viewed as the breadbasket to Europe. So in the Roman times it was. And Africans had food self-sufficiency before colonialism. But after colonialism, when they were enlightened by Western values and of course exploited, now they suffer and they have to require food aid. So I don't think they'd say this is their best point of their history. As for belief in Islam, look, you can't say, I'm a Muslim and I interpret the Quran to believe in two gods. Why? For pure simple reason is these are texts, religion based on text. So the text can't be changed, and so they have to mean something. You can't just, unless you abrogate the text, I don't follow this text anymore, or I now just twist it and say maybe it's only for back then. The only way you can get around it is to do that. But if you follow the text, that's what the text says. So there's no way around it, and that actually helps actually maintain a gold standard of rights that can't be changed due to human convenience. I want to give you one point as a finish up, but before I do so, just to mention the al-Baghdadi figure. If you saw a terror group, which did happen, arise in South America during the 60s and 70s, beheads people, kills people, ransoms hostages for money, we'd say, yeah, this is a standard terror group. It wants to get money for itself. It's doing all these very cynical, horrible things to increase its power and domination. We say, yeah, we wouldn't say that's religion. But when ISIS follow the textbook carbon copy of that, then that's religion. That's what religion does. See, in the Middle East, you can't, unlike South America during the 60s, you can't cite communism or capitalism as your justifying basis. You have to cite what the people believe in to say, well, I'm doing this for justice. And in Islam, we believe we must do justice, and therefore you have to follow me. Whereas in South America, they'll say we have to implement communism because communism is justice, and we should all follow justice. Understand? In fact, you could argue the word justice has probably killed more people than any other word or belief. But anyway, my final point is this. We talk about secular liberalism, right? We talk about the issue of terrorism. Well, does anyone here study politics? Or it's medical school, isn't it? What's the likelihood of that, right? I would say that the two top, or at least the top most political theorist in the 20th century was John Rawls. If anyone knows of him or heard of him, it's John Rawls. You can't read about liberalism unless you read John Rawls. John Rawls talked about something called the Supreme Emergency Exemption, and he wasn't the first person. There's someone called Michael Walzer also. So John Rawls talked about the Supreme Emergency Exemption. I want you all to Google it for yourself. Supreme Emergency Exemption. I'm going to read a quote from what it says. Yeah. He says, this exemption allows us to set aside in certain special circumstances the strict status of civilians that normally prevents their being directly attacked in war. He then talks about the Catholic doctrine. So the Catholic doctrine says that one must never act with the intention of attacking the enemy state by means of taking the innocent lives of its civilians. Political liberalism allows the Supreme Emergency Exemption. The statesman is a central figure in considering the conduct of war and must be prepared to wage a just war in defense of liberal democratic regimes. Michael Walzer also champions this, and they actually form the majority of those who are within the just war theorists within secular liberal thought. They justify it when they say that if it's necessary to win a war, or if your state is under threat, or your people are under threat, in certain circumstances, you can target civilians, according to secular liberalism. But he cites that, but Catholicism disagrees with this. Why is that? Because religion says that there are absolute rules that you can't breach, whereas secular liberalism says if it gets the job done and it's necessary, then it's not sin. And that is not a God I want to follow.
Okay, so final question. Yep, go on.
I was going to ask, because it is a while ago, but AJ mentioned in his opening statement something about institutions and things like institutions like religion, group theories contributing to violence. And I think he also mentioned that you could get around that. But I would argue, this might be naive of me, that entering group per se is kind of natural of humans, because you see it all over the world. So I just wanted you to expand on what you meant by you can get around it or get past the group thing.
Yeah, I agree as well. That's why I brought up, and I tried to, from the beginning, choose the nuance into this debate. It's not just about religion bashing. I could easily replace all of the terms with, or most of the terms with just terms that reference to football fans. You know, as tribes, I think we have an inbuilt human tendency, me as a humanist, as an atheist, a rationalist, studying evolution and how other animals behave. You know, we're part of the animal kingdom. And if you see that, there's certain evolutionary reasons we have for associating in groups, for trying to overlook nuance, for trying to get people on our side using emotion or using, you know, tricks or, you know, things like that. So I think that's quite inbuilt within us. The question is then, do we accept that reality, see that there is this inherent weakness, and then try to overcome it? And how do we overcome it? Well, there seems to be broadly two ways. One is through sort of, you know, religious mythology, and this great God, you know, doesn't want you to do it. Don't displease him, otherwise you'll burn in hell for, you know, eternity. That sort of approach. But there's other approaches, which is more sort of the humanistic, atheistic approach, which says actually we can be a check on each other. You know, if we're in a, you know, that's what democracy is, or that's what a family is, or that's what in a group of friends are. You look out for your friend. You know, if you alone are having to be a check on yourself every single time for every decision, you're going to start doubting yourself. You don't know when you're going off the rails. So that's why you need to have colleagues, friends, families, other people in the community to help you stay on the right track. And even religions, again, also use this, because religions really emphasize family, they emphasize seniority, they emphasize you know, elders and wisdom of elders and passing that down. So I think, you know, again, the nuance shows that these kind of things span, you know, religious ideologies and non-religious ideologies, materialistic and non-materialistic. And I think, as Steve said, if there is, I'm not campaigning for the abolishment of religion, you know, for example, anything like that. I think that's just silly, that's stupid. There are plenty of good things that religions give us. But if you don't want to believe in a religion, if you don't think that's necessary, as Steve thinks, that's not the end of the world. There are actually very, very good ways of living, as Steve referred to the IHU doctrines or other secular, you know, moral worldviews and ways of living, rites of passage, how to behave, not to lie, inbuilt human morality that we're born with. And this is a medical college. If any of you are familiar with universal grammar in linguistics and how we develop a language faculty, if you are, you know, if you grow up with a puppy and a baby in your house and you speak English to both of them, one of them will learn English and speak it back to you, the other one won't. Because the puppy doesn't have the inbuilt grammar genetically in its brain to be able to respond to and pick up language. Language is one of the things that makes us human. Similarly, as David Hume posited a long, long time ago, we have an inbuilt moral faculty as well. We can morally reason out of the womb. And if we just grow up in a jungle without any books, without any religion, without any ideology, religious or not, without Darwin, without, you know, Jesus or without Moses, just in the jungle, we will have a natural inbuilt tendency to be empathetic, to share, to laugh, to cry. Where does that come from? If we don't have any evidence for independently verifiable evidence for God, as far as I can see, scientific evidence, so I would discount the existence of God. So we can only say it's an evolutionary thing, evolutionary, you know, result. So we can use that inbuilt moral tendency that will flourish and develop, like our language faculty flourishes and develops, and we can have judges and courts and, you know, community morality based on that. We don't need necessarily to have a divine revelation, but some people require that. Some people it's not enough. Some people need to have a big, scary thing there, a big, you know, judge or a religious, you know, figure, authority figure to give you some rules and to sort of scare you straight, as it were. Okay, and I'm not judging them. That's fine, but just be open about what it is. That's all I'm saying.
Okay, great. So I think we're going to go to final kind of very quick statements and a couple of sentences, and then we're going to go to a vote. Okay, so start. So literally about 2 sentences, wrap up.
2 sentences wrap up. Before, in the West, they believed in something called natural rights theory, that people have natural rights that God gives them. But then Jeremy Bentham said it's nonsense on stilts. There is no such thing. It's just utilitarianism. The ends, in a way, sometimes justify the means, or what works, basically. The problem is this. Ultimately, then, your rights now depend on whether it's convenient to the majority. And do you really want to live in society where your rights depend on what's convenient, or do you live in a society where your rights depend on an ultimate, untouchable, unassailable basis, which transcends the material world and guarantees your rights in ink or in stone? I think you should decide for yourself what has had a history of achieving that. All I'll say is this: if you look at the West in its secular phase of the 20th century, you'll see that it had a lot of persecutions in different countries of, let's say, Catholics, of Jews, and of Muslims, and it's still continuing, and so on. And these were all justified based on secular basis. However, if you look at, for example, an article that came on the Jewish Chronicle recently, not recently, but a couple of years ago, David J. Wasserstein said that because Islam believes in intolerance, he said, I quote, Islam saved Jewry because it gave a place for Jews to live and to prosper and to study unmolested. Right? And they flourished, and we're proud of this. And because we believe that it's their God-given rights to flourish, their God-given rights to be protected. And I'll end with this. If you believe that humans have innate morality, I'd like to ask you, have you met any children? Have you raised children? Do they look like they have inbuilt morality? Or do you have to correct them? And he says, you need friends to keep you on the right track. Okay, who decides what's the right track? Because equality, rights, dignity, justice, all these words you use, they don't exist in any microscope or any telescope. They're just fictions if you don't believe in any God. So where do they come from? These are fictions that you need to question.
Yeah, so to close, I don't really think we've even scratched the surface in a lot of ways of the actual question, going back to sort of the history of religion and of violence and of peace. All I'd say is, I'm not divorcing violence from religion. I think that they have gone together. There has been violence because of religion and whatever throughout history. All I'm saying is, it's up to you to look at that and to decide according to your own moral standard whether that's legitimate or illegitimate. But do the same with other things. Look at the Western nation state with as much critical analysis as you would with religion. Look at colonialism. The fact of the matter is that this country celebrates imperialists that allowed murder of millions of people to happen through either famine, starvation, other people. They're people that are put on banknotes that are venerated. I don't mind people inviting me here today, talking about religion and violence, criticizing it. I think it's a good debate. I mind it when people do it and they don't do it to other people, when they don't do it to other systems because of the society in which we live in. And, look at things like the Cold War. Look at things like, what happened in South America, in Africa, in the Middle East during the Cold War. Look at what has happened under the empires. We haven't mentioned the Congo today. But if you look at the Congo today, it is just unbelievable what the Belgian Empire did and what European empires have done generally throughout history. Look at them with the same critical analysis that you would approach religion.
For me, what I found myself reflecting on as I've been listening to this debate is just ultimately where is authority? Where does authority? I think that's really been playing out underneath this debate the whole time. It's like where's authority? Do we get authority from? And who do we answer to? Who are we accountable to? And I don't know. I spend a lot of my time because I grew up in Reform Judaism, which is a liberal tradition, which really kind of embraced a lot of rationalist principles of the Enlightenment. I spend a lot of my own religious life and teachings trying to reconnect with some of the more embodied or mystical parts of Judaism that were left behind with mysticism, and yet in somewhat with the Enlightenment and Enlightened rationalism. Yet somehow in this conversation, I've just been feeling more and more better and better about being basically about liberalism, like living in liberal democracy with where the nation state is not entirely, doesn't work entirely, but yeah, is a rule of law and a system of law and authority that is, I don't know, I feel much better about being part of the British liberal society than I would in any kind of like theocracy. That's what I'm reflecting on from this conversation.
Thank you.
I'd like to echo, especially with the points that Daniel just made about liberalism and the importance of having, a variety of views and being able to debate them, without sort of personal attacks or without kind of getting involved in egos, but really just looking at the ideas themselves, objectivity, and also what Suk was saying about having the critical analysis of all ideologies, not just your favoured one gets a bit of a sort of a light treatment, and then the one that you is actually quite convenient for you to attack gets a harsher treatment. I completely echo those both as well, and I would agree. I think one of the main threads that's run through this debate is authority. Is it divine authority or is it human-based authority, and which one is better, and obviously which one leads to more violence? We've considered that, and again, I think what we raised at the start has borne out. Having a definite yes or no answer, I would propose, is a fool's errand, and I think people who try to give that black and white answer don't really have a leg to stand on. But going towards that nuance helps us more. And the second thread that I see running through is this idea of causality, and I think to the extent that we misunderstand the philosophical concept of causality, how people make decisions, how A leads to B, it's complicated. It's not just in one input, process and output. We're not just robots. We have complicated ways of making decisions. The point was made about how we decide what is justice. And the claim was made that justice is even fictional because you can't see it under a microscope. Well, triangles, a perfect triangle, a platonic solid, the perfect cube, you can't see that under a microscope, but it's a useful concept and it exists because I'm talking about it. Does love exist? Can you see that under a microscope? No, but we all will accept that love exists. Love is a phenomenon that we see in our world. We reference it, we write songs about it. Similarly, justice, that exists in our world, and we decide what it is, we would propose. And talking about fiction, justice being a fiction, and a God not being fiction, or miracles not being fiction, when you can't scientifically, investigate them and interrogate them, I think that certainly has to be, we have to approach that with quite caution and not just sort of bandy the word around about what is fiction and what is not. So I would say, in closing, let's approach the nuance. Let's approach, as Suk said, both religion and non-religious ideas with a critical eye, and I think that will, lead us to a better place rather than trying to, go towards a tribalistic view and things. And thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Okay, I think we're going to have a quick vote. So, by show of hands, should we just close it?
Are you having an abstain option, or should?
Yeah. So there will be three options. So firstly, raise your hand if you think religion has mainly caused peace throughout history. Yeah.
Sorry, what?
So yeah, raise your hand if you think, because we're looking at the debate, mainly peace versus mainly religion. Put your hand up if you think religion has been mainly the cause of peace.
So mainly the cause of peace, or has religion mainly caused peace?
So yeah, mainly caused peace. Sorry, yes, I see.
So
we clarified that earlier, yes.
Yeah, it was confusing for me actually. So put your hand up if you think religion's main cause is peace rather than violence.
And then just raise your hands just so I can count up if you disagree and you believe it.
Put your hands up if you think
religion mostly leads to violence.
Yeah, mostly leads to violence.
And put a hand up if you neither disagree. If you neither agree or disagree.
You abstain.
Yeah, you abstain.
Oh, can we work and vote as well?
Can we vote?
We're biased.
We're not voting.
Yeah, I thought.
Okay.
Well, I think that was really interesting for me anyway. I hope you guys found it really interesting. I think we started this society because we wanted to question our own views more, and politically, our views on other religions, our views on other views about anything, whether it be environmental or just about anything you can think of. So I definitely think that this tonight has really made me question my views on lots of different things. And that's why we started this society. I've come away with more questions than I had before, which is, I think, what the aim was. And I think we can live with lots of different religions in the same society if we question them and we can speak like this openly about all of these. And I think it's the best way to have a happier society with less violence. So thank you for coming and being so interesting. So yeah, just final word.